Glory to Jesus Christ, Slava Isus Christou. This is Father Jack Custer at St. Michael's Cathedral in Passaic, New Jersey, back with session 2 of our new series on Catholic social teaching. If you're joining me right now and you haven't yet listened to session 1 on Catholic social teaching, I would advise you to go back and listen to that first before following along with this second presentation. If you've been with me through the first presentation and you're back for more, I admire your stamina, and we'll pick up right where we left off. We're talking about the encyclical letter of Pope Leo XIII, issued on May 15th, 1891, called Rerum Novarum, on the new social conditions, on the new things, literally in Latin, where Pope Leo draws on natural law, the recognition of the way God created this world and the human beings in it as the foundation for drawing moral, ethical, social principles for society, and specifically for economics, and most specifically for the rights of workers. This happens at a time when cities, both in Europe and the United States, are draining the countryside of young people who are coming to the cities for these new factory and mill and mine jobs. And where especially Southern and Eastern Europe are being drained of their young male populations who are fleeing both a series of wars and economic depression and social discrimination and miserable conditions, in the hope of finding a better life in America. And like most immigrants, they swore they were just going to come and make money and go home and buy land and live the life they'd always known in a better way. We're here because that didn't happen for most of them. In the first session, we talked about the foundational principles on which Pope Leo bases his teaching. And I repeat that the foundations of this teaching are not so specifically Catholic. They are not grounded necessarily in revelation or theology. They are principles that are self-evident from natural law, from an honest recognition of the way human beings are and the way this world is. Principles like self-preservation, the centrality of the family, the right to private property, the right of free association, and distributive justice, giving each person his due. Pope Leo draws from these principles some specific guidance for the relationship between employers, that is to say the industrialists, the capitalists, and again, this encyclical never uses the word capitalist or capital even, the entrepreneurs, the men who were building the mines, the mills, the factories, the relations between them and their laborers. Pope Leo says the duty of the worker is to fully and faithfully perform that which has been freely agreed upon. I've agreed to take this job. The job entails doing this and this and this. I will do this and this and this to the best of my ability. Secondly, never to injure the property or outrage the person of the employer. No physical violence. Never to resort to violence, riot, or disorder. This sounds kind of authoritarian. Pope Leo is going to come back in a few minutes and talk about the workers' right to strike, but that right does not include violence, riot, or disorder. And that's a distinction that is very current this summer, in 2020. The entrepreneurs, the capitalists, the industrialists, Leo generally calls them the wealthy, because they could also simply be, in some cultures, the man who owns all the land on which other people worked as tenant farmers, not owning the land, but being allowed to work on it in exchange for a certain percentage of the crops. Many of our ancestors all over Europe lived this life as tenant farmers. The obligations of these wealthy persons are the following: to respect the dignity of every person, quote, not to misuse men as though they were things in the pursuit of gain. Thirdly, and this sounds totally strange in our culture today, to respect the good of the worker's soul. I ask you if your employer has ever given you any reason to believe he's concerned for the good of your soul. And by that, Pope Leo means the time and freedom to worship. You think about it, it's to some degree true today. It was certainly more true in boom times, when you could never mine enough coal or produce enough cloth, factories, or make enough steel. The factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Pope Leo is insisting that a human person has the right to time to worship God. The wealthy have an obligation not to expose the worker to corrupting influences. This sounds a little paternalistic, but let's remember what the situation is. You've got young men and young women coming off farms from every nation in Europe, showing up in the United States, taking whatever work they were offered, sometimes living in company housing. And it was very, very easy for employers to both hand you your wage and then take it back from you by making sure that right on the premises or right outside the premises of your mine or your mill or your factory was a company-owned saloon and maybe a company-supported house of prostitution besides. So you've got all these displaced young men and women who are getting cold, hard cash in their hands for the first time. An employer could be very, very callous in teaching these young men and women all kinds of ways to misuse that money. We used to joke about our small mill towns and mining towns in the eparchy of Passaic that there was a church and a bar on every corner. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's interesting that the only socially minded encyclical that the first Greek Catholic bishop in the United States, Sotirotenski, who was here from 1907 to 1916, the only encyclical he ever wrote on a social issue was about alcoholism. And employers had a large part to play in that. In many places, you lived in company housing, shopped in company stores, were exposed to all kinds of wrong ways to spend your money. As I look around this neighborhood in Passaic, that hasn't changed. Lots of young men come to this neighborhood all alone, seeking day labor. And on Saturday nights, you can see them roaming Market Street and roaming Monroe Street, from one bar to the other, just looking for some way to feel better and have a little fun. And if folks are not taught better, we will seize the comfort that's made available to us, and a really shrewd employer will own the bar right outside the factory. Pope Leo insists that the employer has an obligation not to lead his employee to neglect his home or his family or to squander his earnings. Again, it's about company stores, saloons, gambling joints, prostitution joints, that sort of thing. Leo says an employer should make no demands beyond a person's age, strength, and sex. Please remember, this is a period in which women are working outside the home in many cases for the first time, especially in the textile industries and the clothing industries. And child labor is rampant in the mines and in the mills. Leo specifically condemns what he calls, I quote, exercising pressure upon the indigent and the destitute for the sake of gain, and to gather one's profit out of the needs of another. Leo says this is condemned by all laws, human and divine. He goes on, I quote, to defraud the worker of his wages is a sin that cries to heaven for vengeance. That's a quote from the Epistle of St. James, chapter 5, verse 4. He condemns specifically cutting workmen's wages by usury, that is to say, charging exorbitant interest, fraud, or force. How would an employer cut a workman's wages by usury? If I can only buy in the company store and my wages do not suffice to buy the things I need, the company store may lend me credit at interest. And if my wages continue not to meet my needs, I'll continue to rack up debt, which will continue to rack up interest. This was crude, rude, and simple in a mining town, and it was all about need. The same thing happens with credit card debt. And sometimes it's about need, and sometimes it's about a failure to be moderate in what we will allow ourselves to have. Another way that employers could cut workmen's wages by fraud is to take advantage of the fact that this workforce largely was uneducated and didn't speak much English. Another way to take advantage of these workmen was to play one against another. And this is an ugly story, especially in the history of the mines. The older emigration from Ireland and Wales, which was an English-speaking immigration, or at least an English-capable immigration right from the start in northeastern Pennsylvania, had managed to gain a certain amount of standing and had gained themselves something like a living wage. Then along come the Italians and the Slavs. And mine owners were quite happy to hire these new immigrants who were willing to work for less money than the old Irish or Welsh immigrants, thereby creating all kinds of hostility between the older immigration group and the newer immigration group, and getting the same amount of work done for a whole lot less money by defrauding the new immigrants of the full pay that they were already offering the older immigrants. This led to some real violence in a couple of cases in our own eparchy in northeastern Pennsylvania. Another abuse that the Holy Father condemns is overwork. He envisions overwork as something that's only imposed by employers, and he says it proceeds from greed. I'll keep you working so you'll make more money for me. But overwork, especially in our own culture today, may often be the result of our own greed, where we begin to value more money in our paycheck, more buying power than good things like Sunday worship or time spent with family. It's greed in both cases. Pope Leo pays a special attention to strenuous labor, the exact kind of labor that our immigrant ancestors came here to do: mines, quarries, mills. I quote, "As a general principle, it may be laid down that a workman ought to have leisure and rest proportionate to the wear and tear of his strength." Just to say, someone working in a coal mine needs more time to rest than someone working in an office. But in fact, that is exactly what was not happening. In number 43, Pope Leo addresses a very delicate point. The basic morality of wage labor is that an employer makes a job available at a stated wage, and you and I are free to accept that job at that wage or not. In theory, we're free. In theory, we enter into this contract knowing what we're getting into and freely accepting it. Now, we've already seen a moment ago how industrialists would use this to play new arrivals against older, established laborers. Something similar is probably happening all over corporate America as salaried employees in their middle and late 50s are shown the door to make room for someone who would come into the job at an entry-level salary. Some things don't change. The Pope condemns this. The employers have an obligation to pay what he calls a living wage. Wages, I quote, ought not to be insufficient. He wrote in Latin. They do fancy things like this. Let me put it in English. Wages ought to be sufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. Now remember, the Holy Father imagines that only the father of the family, and maybe teenage children, are wage earners. Mom's at home. This is a one-wage family. And the Holy Father says the wages of this one man should be sufficient to feed, clothe, and shelter a nice, big Catholic family. How far have we come from that? This is immediately relevant to the current discussion about a mandatory minimum wage, isn't it? Pope Leo also mentions the spiritual interests of the working man. I'm not free, Leo says, to accept a job that is going to damage my health or damage my soul. The first interest of the working man, Pope Leo says, should be the interest of his soul. I quote, "No man has in this matter power over himself. To consent to any treatment which is calculated to defeat the end and purpose of his being is beyond his right. He cannot give up his soul to servitude, for it is not man's own rights which are here in question, but the rights of God, the most sacred and inviolable of rights." Therefore, in number 41, Pope Leo absolutely demands freedom from the obligation to work on Sundays and holy days. Again, look how this impacts our own experience of labor today. On the subject of a living wage, how many families are two-paycheck families, not because they want to be, but because they have to be? How many Catholics regularly and willingly accept that labor on Sunday that is going to keep them from worship is just a fact of life? How many Catholic families will smile indulgently and let their teenage children take their first jobs, which will take them away from church and worship every Sunday? It's okay because he's working. That's okay, right? Leo says here we're selling our souls for a wage at this point. And the example of observant Jews on this subject is just so enlightening. It takes a fortune to live a kosher lifestyle. And an observant Jewish family is going to have many children, just like an observant Catholic family will be open to many children. In an observant Jewish family, nobody is doing wage or salaried labor from sundown on Friday until sundown on Saturday. In an observant Jewish family, if you're in retail, that means you're missing one of the biggest retail days of the week. But it's obvious in the lives of these people that they can observe the Sabbath and still prosper. That's an act of faith on their part. It's an act of faith we could stand to imitate. Leo says it's our obligation to observe the Lord's Day, and it's our obligation as employers to make sure our employees get the same treatment. In all of this, Leo is addressing an issue. I kind of raised it a minute ago and then got lost. That employers had workers and may still have workers at a disadvantage. You're hungry. You need a house. You need food. You've got to feed and clothe your kids. You need a job. I'm offering you this job for just this much money. It's either this or nothing. If you don't take it, the guy right behind you will. That's the kind of power the employer had, maybe still has, over his employees. It's a free market. And the market says somebody's going to take that job at that lower wage. Leo says that whole system is corrupt. The laborer has a right to a wage that will support himself and his family. That may be the most radical thing in this encyclical. think I'm going to end here and come back for a third session, which gets very much into the history of our own people. So let me close here, having talked about the living wage. Let me close with this observation. In number 44 of Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo gets a bit Catholic for the first time, really, and reminds us that work is necessary as a result of original sin. He quotes God's statement to Adam, by the sweat of your brow will you earn your bread. So work may not be entirely pleasant, but it is also necessary, and it is by the sweat of my brow that I get my bread. And Leo uses that statement to tell the employer, your wage has to be sufficient to get this man and his family their bread. It's a biblical way of insisting on the right to a living wage. And he says this: the preservation of life is the bounden duty of one and all. To be wanting therein is a crime. Glory to Jesus Christ.